Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Tim Kirby Russia. With me is Joaquin Flores. It's been way too long, Joaquin, but we're both busy men and both fathers, so this is what happens. But anyways, we're here today, and actually, I laugh, but we have a very serious topic today. It's about Trump. It's about the
Hmm.
elections, and I want to talk to you because I, of course, read my own comments on Telegram. I read your channel very often and the comments there. And a lot of people have, over the past few years, written this. If we, or you or I, say anything positive about Trump, the sort of reaction is, there are two sides of the same coin. Trump is part of the system. Look what he did with his first term. There's no point. So, anyways, Joaquin, is Trump in some ways different from other American politicians? Is he somehow a potential to make change in America? Essentially, who is Mr. Trump? Or is he really just part of the machine, and you and I are kind of suckers for guys who have hot ex-wives and billions of dollars and could crack a good joke?
I think intelligent people can disagree. I'm not of the opinion that he's, one of the two sides of the same coin, just to put it out there to, resolve that question right away. But intelligent people and very serious thinkers and very, qualified experts can disagree about this because I think what he is actually doing requires it to be uncertain. I don't think there's any, unless you're like a fly on the wall in some bunker or in a secret room or Mar-a-Lago. I think there's no way of really knowing, exactly what the plot is, or what's inside his mind, or what his motives are. All we can really look at is the various fruits that the movement that he has been involved in or sparked, MAGA, the populism, or the legislation and the things that he did while he was in office, taking on big pharma, in particular, towards the end of his administration. If you can look at a phenomenon, and there's two, very thorough ways to assess that phenomenon, and there's ambiguity about the nature of it, and to what degree he's actually part of the system or not part of the system, or whatever. um, I think there are arguments from both ways that he is and isn't. I'm not of the opinion that he is part of some conspiracy with the same people that tried to assassinate him. That would be hard to, I think, explain away. Um, and it's been more than one attempt now on his life. And I think one of the things that people, when they look at his rhetoric, not his actions, but his rhetoric on Iran, his rhetoric, not his actions, but his rhetoric on Israel, or his rhetoric on China, which I think actually with that probably gets mischaracterized more than it is his own rhetoric. He's always advocated for changes to the trade agreements between U.S. and China, never for hostility, and Taiwan was really never his issue. And you can actually, with the most recent thing he said about this, is very funny. He gave a NATO rationale to Taiwan, in the sense of, he said, if Taiwan isn't going to pay us to
Oh,
defend them, then why should we do anything? And this is clearly about microchips, generally microchips. So the United States trying to get an increase in its own domestic microchip production. Taiwan is a major competitor. And of all the things with mainland China, of all the things that mainland China has done in the past, since like the COVID and the reset stuff, all of their exports on oceanic lines, ocean-based supply line stuff, all of their exports have decreased notably since that time, except for microchips. So superconductor work is very big. Uh, yeah, it's a very, I think it's a very big question, Tim, and it's I think it's, like I said, it's a $64,000 question, and it's something that intelligent people can see both ways, and there's different facts that you could draw from that point, in opposite directions, right? And if you understand this also as a psychological operation, an intelligence operation, there are different. I would call the question like a Warsaw block type of question, because
Oh,
from the perspective of the viewer is going to determine which way their angle shows, what contours of the question that they see, how
yeah.
it's colored in their mind. And like, so with Trump, and let's say, what's a good question would be, Ukraine, Russia. When he talks about Ukraine and Russia, he's not hesitant uh, to blame Zelensky for having been able to prevent the war and not. He's not hesitant to point, and that points, of course, to uh, Johnson and others who
But the
involved him.
counterpoint from within Russia and the Russian media, and why people here were extremely disappointed by Trump, is that the arming of Ukraine continued. But then again, that also goes in that thing is, to what extent could Trump really control the military industrial complex? But again, essentially, the sort of Ukraine project continued full speed under his management. That didn't change very much.
Yeah, I mean, it is, we're not, there are no counterfactual histories to compare to. So I mean, if you had Hillary Clinton
Mm-hmm.
at in office in 2016, the question would not have been, a few hundred or a few thousand stingers or whatever. It would have been a question of war against Russia. In fact,
Mm.
when you think about the sanctions that Trump undertook in his time, and the Obama era sanctions as well, towards the end of the Obama administration, 2015, against Russia, the sanctions that Trump took against Russia, if you really deconstruct them, it's very strange. It tells a different story. The high resolution view. It's like Russia was targeted specifically in the areas where it would benefit the most from import substitution industrialization. So it's like, when you think about the way that, if there's a big question, if the world had gone to war in 2016 and 2017, well, it would have been starting after January 2017 with the arrival of Hillary Clinton as president. We wouldn't be talking. I'm sure we would not be talking about, how many stingers or how many, man pads or whatever did Trump sell to Ukraine or buy or give or what have you. It would be a question of mutually assured destruction, and
Oh,
we'd be having right. So we'd be having the conversation now that we're having then. Um, so, or we'd be having the conversation then that we're having now with regard to this kind of Cuban Missile Crisis that we're practically in, or that we have exceeded in some ways with the nuclear brinksmanship. Also, real fighting wars on multiple fronts. Maybe things even popping off with South Korea, North Korea. And anyhow, there are so many different ways to look at this, and yet, and it's going to be shaded by the way you're looking at it. And from the perspective of America's partners, there are, think about it, if we treat this as a total psychological operation, right? Let's just imagine that the whole Trump thing is a psyop. Well, what would the point of the psyop be? Now, so this is separate and aside from the domestic stuff and, keeping population placated or believing in democratic institutions, although it's going to be difficult for them to believe in it if they don't let him win this election, right? But if
oh,
the
well,
whole
yeah.
point is right. So if you think about the war, and you think about the pandemic, Tim, um, you know, when Trump, one of the criticisms against Trump was his release of the untested, unsafe vaccine or gene therapy as some sort of answer to this pandemic. So when people think about the pandemic in this sense, they normally, if they are hesitant about the vaccine or believe without a lack of evidence, in my opinion, that there is a connection between gene therapy or vaccine injury and having taken this vaccine or gene therapy, the COVAX, let's say, if that had not been released to the public within the short period of time, remember that Pfizer and J&J and AstraZeneca were saying that they wanted a couple of years to produce this.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the rolling lockdowns. Think about the effect on trade, on commerce,
Hmm.
international trade, supply line, volume of supply line trade, right? Think about all of that. Think about if there had been the kind of thing that we had during that March and April, May, at the beginning of the pandemic, before it was announced that a vaccine would be released very soon, by the end of the year. Um, Keep in mind that you had all of these countries that it really doesn't matter if Cuba or South Africa or Russia even produces its own vaccine. That's going to be great for themselves. That's going to be great for whoever else in the world that they can distribute it to or sell it to. That's not the issue. The issue is that if in the United States, right, which makes up what, like 20 or 30% of global imports, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there had been a significant reduction of that, I mean, it's in some areas, Americans, if the vaccine had not been released and if Americans were not free to work and consume, even if it was reduced by 10% or something like this would have sent shockwaves throughout the global south where a lot of things are made. It would have created a humanitarian crisis, a mass poverty, uh, food scarcity, many things that we see. Now, imagine that scenario, Tim, and then imagine that the plan, when the Biden administration came in, had already been to initiate an invasion of the Donbass with the
Mm-hmm.
150 or 200,000 soldiers that they were mounting near the border. That was the subject, of course, of the failed Lavrov Blinken talks before the outbreak of the special military operation a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So the thing to understand is that that would have still happened, but that would have happened in a world, right, where countries were consuming less energy
Mm-hmm.
because they were producing less, because Americans were consuming less. So Russia's market for its export of energy would have been very different. Its export of energy to China,
Ah.
export of energy. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm saying I agree with you. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, so the global export import market would have been a shambles. And then Russia would have been attacked the same, and they would have had to do something preemptive, but they would have been doing so in a context where maybe there was a belief that they could have been contained because China and India and Brazil, who are huge producing countries and huge energy consuming countries, to make that production happen would have been, we're just talking about even a 5, 10, 15% decrease would have had ripple effects. And then think about the human immigration crisis into the first world that would have caused. So when I think about the Trump years and the things and the gestures or whatever he did in that direction of things that people say, hey, this is something that's problematic or this is a red
Yeah.
flag, I always say, look, no, you have to look at the things that didn't happen that very clearly were in a big plan. And if they were not in a big plan, then hey, hire me because I would have come up with it. I would have
Oh.
said, hey, make the pandemic happen so that it reduces, the world's need for production, energy for production, and reduce, Russia's energy exports by 10%, 20%, whatever, and then see them finance and deal with the conflict in Ukraine. So this would have been you can see the fragments and the shadows of a plan that never materialized. And you understand that they nevertheless go through with the different contingent parts of those plans, even if the main vector didn't materialize. There's a lot of I think we've talked about that before. We don't need to break it down for folks today,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
in common sense, it's like you don't want to have a vacuum or suction of support underneath you because you declare that this other thing isn't going forward, and each thing has to keep going forward, and then you have X factors and things like that. Like you don't know, maybe you could still wing it, but it is so the people focus on Trump's rhetoric, but they don't really make an analysis of the actual actions that were taken. At the same time, tying back to the first point, the fact that intelligent people can disagree and it's hard to discern whether he's part of the American system or he's an outsider, like if he's anti-systemic or part of the system. It's almost a false dichotomy. It's almost a non-question, because the point is that the result is the same. Like, the United States is going to pivot away from what it's doing. And it needs to sell that pivot not as a betrayal of its partners and its allies, but as, oh, this insurgent other guy took over.
You just said something very big then. So you said the United States, regardless whether Trump is honest or dishonest, the United States is going to make a major pivot. So the United States acknowledges that it's going to be in a multipolar world or something, or what do you mean by that?
It has acknowledged it. It has acknowledged it. In fact, 13 months ago in October, September, Anthony Blinken made a huge statement. He said, really, he summarized the experience with the conflict in Ukraine. He summarized the fact that Russia cannot be contained. They cannot be destroyed militarily. They cannot be contained economically. And what he said is, this is going to go down in history. And students in our field, international relations, are going to be studying this question for a generation or two to come. Because he said, these were his words, he said, this is not a challenge to the post-Cold War order. This is the end of it. Russia and China have a tacit alliance that is limitless. A limitless friendship, I think, is the word. So a limitless potential for agreements on a whole array of vectors, from security, trade, and so forth. So you think about the SCO, you think about all of these things, all figure in very prominently.
Wow, that's my mind's a little bit blown here. That's the first time I've heard anyone say that. But then, what's then the point of keeping up this sort of hegemonic charade? Because in a lot of ways, some people would argue that why does the war in Ukraine continue to go on is that there's more than just, it's a corruption, money-feeding scheme. It's basically, well, if the West just gives up, then this might be the mask pull moment, that the global hegemony is over.
Yeah, well, American global hegemony is not over, because the United States will continue to have the potential to have a significant impact on events anywhere in the world, the definition of global hegemony. But in terms of sole global hegemony, or being the only global hegemon, that is over. There are other global hegemon, right? And the point is that they changed their criteria in the United States. They deranked or downpowered the ranking of Russia so that the wrong shoe would fit the foot, meaning that they said that Russia is not a global hegemon. So they ignore the fact that it has, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 ICBMs, nuclear warheads. They ignore that fact. They ignore the fact that the Chinese are interdependent with the Russian on a vector of things. They ignore the fact that the Russian Navy can materialize in Venezuela, in Cuba. It can materialize anywhere in the Mediterranean, in the Adriatic soon. So they're just not recognizing the reality, but they know this. So I believe that they did something that was malfeasant. I think that they looked at the evidence that Russia is a global hegemon, and they said, we're going to downrank it anyway. Why did they downrank it? There's a very important strategic part here in U.S. doctrine, is that if you are in a potential conflict or arms race or actual hot conflict with a global hegemon, the metric, the formula about how you deal with them is totally different from if you just consider them to be a local or regional hegemon. If you consider them to be a local or regional hegemon, right, then you can get them to back off by escalation, by your escalation, which signals to them too high a cost to go forward. But if they are a global hegemon, number one, and number two, they are dealing with an existential crisis, then the concept, the strategy of escalation, right, to show that the cost is too high for them is not going to work, because number one, the cost is not too high, and number two, they have no other choice. So I believe that this was done on purpose so that they could do this anyway, recycle all or get rid of, dispose of a bunch of 1990s generation military equipment to get ready for next generation, and also to destroy Ukraine and to cripple the European economy along the way. Why, for Tim, is Germany paying as a consequence of its own suicidal sanctions against Russia? Why are they paying almost 2 times the average median price for energy among G7 countries? How competitive can Germany be if they're paying between 1.5 and 2 times energy?
Well, it's not. That's why some insane percentage of German businesses have already left the country. It's crazy. It was something like a third. It was ridiculous, but that's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is part of the revassalization of Europe. So after World War II in Western Europe, the United States goes in, City of London, Wall Street, and they basically vassalize the Western European economy. Now, ever since the creation of the Euro, European Union, and as a formal with its own currency, which was always, of course, tied to the dollar, people used to call it the Euro dollar and things like this. There's a degree of capital accumulation that stays within Europe, which has the potential, or is the real instantiation of autonomous economic functions. So even though they're in alliance with the West, and even though there are so many at the level of the IMF and the level of Western transatlantic banking institutions, of course, they're tied in. And of course, Wall Street and the City of London is the big brother. The Anglo-Saxons are the big brother with the Franco-Germans. But the Franco-Germans are, to their own extent, have some autonomous economic capital accumulation. And that trajectory goes upward, especially if they don't have to spend as much for defense and other things, especially if they're getting cheap energy from Russia. So, I mean, the possibilities for the West European economy prior to this conflict were great. I mean, they had a great direction to go, because while they were running out of steam in terms of the speculation about new EU members, because there's only the end of how much EU can expand, they nevertheless had very cheap energy from Russia. And they had they were spending, 1%, less than 2%, we know, of GDP on defense. We know that NATO countries were spending less than excuse my French, less than 2% GDP.
Oh, that's okay. I can't. I'm already developing Tourette's. I swear all the time here, so it's fine.
I know. I've got it is Tourette's, bro. That's I'm gonna borrow that. That's hilarious. So the United States spends like 40%, 50%, depending on you can show numbers that show like 60% of GDP in the US is spent on defense, right? So that's a huge difference. So in Europe, they've got university, healthcare, dental, retirement, social security, right? All these things that Americans don't have, and they're saying, hey, we need a populist movement to get these things, secure these things, right? All these different things are going on. So with Europe, you can see that the United States knows it can't harm Russia. There's always a possibility that something unknown will happen. That's an X factor. That's the unknown. But among the universe of known knowns and known unknowns, there's not a way that this conflict can lead to either Russia having a military defeat in Ukraine, or that Russia would have a socioeconomic or political economic crisis where elites or oligarchs pressure Putin to make an agreement or even step down. So these were the kind of the fantasies that the Biden administration was openly saying after they had admitted that they cannot militarily defeat Russia. What they were saying is, no, this is supposed to create pressure, economic pressure, and containment and isolation through sanctions. But then they admit that those don't work. So I would propose to him that they always knew these things wouldn't work, because the math is pretty simple, and it's pretty simple to not see it, and it's too simple to ignore. So I'm going to say that they knew it, and it makes a lot of sense that they knew it, because the real benefit for them is to revassalize Europe, number one, and number two, in no particular order, and number two, like, Russia's going to get Ukraine anyway. I mean, why were there 2 color revolutions in Ukraine? Because Ukraine was drifting towards Russia. which is the process of natural, economic, political, social, cultural. I mean, imagine like the iceberg under, and you have the tip of the iceberg is what you see. I mean, even what you see, Russia and Ukraine are very similar.
Yeah.
And beneath the surface, there's a deeper connection. The deep culture of Russians and Ukrainians is much more intertwined than this conflict would lead us to believe, let's say. So what that means in concrete terms is that in the West, right, at Langley, in the Beltway, in DC, at the Pentagon, Ukrainians are a type of Russian. And the more Ukrainians that you can get to die, flee the country, and or whatever, are less future Russians.
So what you're proposing here is a smart Washington theory, because a lot of the experts who talk about the Ukraine war have a stupid Washington theory, that they really think that the Ukraine is something different from the Russians and that they would somehow be able to, again, create the crisis or do something. And you think that in deep down, they don't say it, but deep down, they know they actually agree with Russia's view of Ukraine. They just want to fuck over Russia. That's your position.
Correct. They fundamentally agree with Russia's view of Ukraine. They fundamentally analyzed Russia's red lines. They made an assessment of those red lines during the Blinken-Lavrov talks that broke down. But the United States counted the paces that they needed to count during those talks. And they said, this is how much that we can push without it provoking a nuclear response from Russia. I do believe there still do not have consensus on the desirability or non-desirability of a nuclear response from Russia. I think that introduces too much that is hard for them to contain and to keep themselves safe. But nevertheless, they would have proceeded. What are the limits of conventional war? How can we keep the conflict limited in Ukraine?
Well, one thing
How can we recycle?
Sorry to interrupt you, but this is important. But what about revenge? Do they not see that as possible? That a lot of people over the years die in mysterious circumstances, that the Russians might not kind of put together a hit list of all the people who did this to them, or they think that's impossible. They could never touch them.
It's the U.S. policy. I think that it's conceivable, Tim. Yeah. So that's why they're keeping the conflict. I think that both sides have a tacit understanding of the desirability of keeping the conflict limited to Ukraine, except for where we can see conflicts in the Asia Pacific or the Middle East. But I don't think that they want to provoke Russia to do something where they have to seize Latvia or seize Lithuania, which they could probably do within 3 months if they needed to. But this is something that while they're doing this operation in Ukraine, this is, these are the types of pressures. You can see that they might get this idea that is desirable, but they need to limit certain possibilities of triggering a nuclear response from Russia, unless, Tim, they actually want Russia to nuke certain parts of Europe just for Great Reset reasons. So there's, when you think about, just thinking broadly, Tim, like when you think about when Netanyahu forced vaccinated the entire Israeli population, what type of message were they sending to elites around the world? It's like, oh, you guys think you're going to target Israeli civilians? Watch, hold my beer. We'll do it first. You see? So
wow. Brutal.
Right. So there's so many ways to look at these events and to understand what messages are being sent and, what is the real point. And it's germane to ask the question whether Trump is part of this or not. But the point is that if he's not part of it, it's actually, if Trump is part of the system, then that's better news in a lot of ways, because then it means that there's some coherency in a strategy that, okay, we're going to pretend that Trump is this insurgent character, and that's the reason, that's the pretext that we broke off transatlantic relations. Not broke off, but dwindled, right?
Yeah,
and that way those Western leaders associated with the World Economic Forum, globalism, the Democratic Party, and the neocons and the Republican Party, that way they maintain credibility with those partners that they are simultaneously betraying.
Oh,
so because So
Okay.
there's many layers.
So that
Yes.
leads into my final question because I promised I wouldn't keep you very long today. So the final question is, how will the first 100 days of Trump differ from the first 100 days of Kamala? Will either candidate have any sort of major effect on the war in Ukraine? And to be honest, I didn't write this in the question when I sent it to you, but will it have any effect on America? Because I still,
Yeah, no, it's
yeah,
that is a very good question. I think about the things that if Kamala Harris becomes the president, the trajectory, it could be the last election that we have in the United States. The trajectory towards a one-party state and the desire of that among a large segment of the elites is dangerously high. A dangerously high desire to have a one-party state. Um, the thing is that having consolidated power, uh, if Kamala Harris becomes the president, the things that they are threatening to do, the things that she could do under a type of fake populism of the symbolism of her gender and sex, a type of like a left populism that focuses on the things that Joe Biden is not. Joe Biden is white, he's old, he's a male.
yeah.
Kamala Harris is relatively younger than Trump, younger than Biden. She's a female, she's Indian and other things, perhaps we don't know.
Yeah.
But the point is that she's a woman of color or identifies that way or has convinced others that she is. Take your pick, doesn't matter. What at the end of the day is that they will be able to do things like increase the number of Supreme Court justices or recognize Puerto Rico as a state or allow increasing economic and political autonomy for California, Oregon, and Washington on the left coast. So these are things that could further the number of seats in Senate, further the number of seats in Congress. They want to increase.
Gosh,
So basically,
I
they
never
would.
thought about that. Puerto Rico could be electoral points for the Democrats every 4 years. Interesting.
Yes, yes, and you can see that the balance is very, very tight, but very, very tight. This is like we're very similar to kind of like a Missouri Compromise crisis in the United States in terms of Civil War type stuff, in terms of those dynamics. I don't know if anyone has the appetite for it or who would be against who,
Yeah.
but it's a thing.
That's like in Russian, there's a word voinstvenly, and I don't know. I think in English we'd say something like warlike, and I think the average person in the United States, regardless of race or background, is not voinstvenly. So people talk about the potential of a civil war, but I just don't think the psychology is there. Like when
Yeah,
Russia expanded in ancient Russian history, they met voinstvenly and not voinstvenly people, and the not voinstvenly people just sort of were like, "Okay, take us over." They just kind of went along
right.
with things, or, if they didn't like Christianity, they just go pray in the woods and pretend like it's not happening. So, anyways,
Yeah, a civil war in the United States would not be like a populist uprising. It wouldn't be like people versus elites. I
yeah,
mean, you would have that propaganda turned up to 20,000, of course, in such an event. But what we're talking about are economic elites in the United States. If they opt for some type of formal it's just a bizarre it's a bizarre thing. But all of this was written out. It was published in the Atlantic. It was published in all these newspapers, mainstream Wall Street Journal, everything. Back in 2020, it was called the Transition Integrity Project.
hmm
What Biden should do if Trump takes power in 2020. So if Harris comes into power, Biden was just a placeholder. Biden was like biding time.
yeah,
Kamala Harris are going to be able to move forward on the agenda because Trump will never run again, right?
yeah. He's too old.
And that's the end of an era then. And that's kind of like a lot of wind out of the sails of that movement. And to demoralize the population that way, to show them really like there's only one winning side, and then do some kind of Pavlovian thing with the population so they don't ever think about this again. And they would be demoralized in the back of their minds or even in the front of their minds, but they'd be demoralized. And they want to demoralize the American elites that are backing Kamala Harris, want more than anything else to demoralize any segment of America that thinks that there's some alternative to their status quo.
Very good. So there's a big difference, I guess, potentially in the first 100 days. Anyways, Joaquin Flores, thank you very much for being with us. Where can people find out more about you or subscribe to something or view your most recent project, whatever that may be?
Yes. So on Telegram, at New Resistance is a channel I curate, and most of my stuff from that winds up around the internet, this will publish somewhere. Everything that winds up when I'm in it, I put it on the channel. Also, as I've been deleted over time from YouTube, Tim, people have found some of my older gems from the past and just uploaded them themselves to Rumble. So if you just type my name out in Rumble, you'll get a lot of different stuff from over the years, sometimes still on YouTube. Not my channels, just stuff that other people have made excerpts or uploaded. And then Telegram is my main venue right now. My main.
I was actually able to sort of sneak my way back onto Rumble, but thankfully Rumble doesn't delete things. They may be forced to block things because of, like, especially French legislation. For some reason, France has a heavy hand in their dealings, as does Canada. But they don't delete stuff. It's still there somewhere. So, for now. Anyways, Joaquin, thank you very much for being with me. Guys, remember, speaking of channels and social media, Tim Kirby Russia Hardcore on Telegram. Go there. Anyways, talk to you later.